talk about privately is between us. Our session today is called How to Comfort the Suffering. How to Comfort the Suffering. And our text is going to be from the portion of Shmini. And I'm so grateful that Eric is pitching in for Shuli, who's really an unbelievable. Shuli she really cares for her family, for everyone. And I'm grateful to Eric. Just to connect with Eric for me is uplifting. So we are now in chapter 10, and I'm going to be reading the first three sentences. And it's quite jarring when one reads these sentences. Here is what it says. We're now on the eighth day of the dedication of the temple. And this was the moment. This was the moment when Aaron and his sons are assuming the priestly responsibility. In the 7 days of preparation, Moshe had acted as the high priest. What is the term? Pro tempore? I'm not sure if that's the term, but he was actually the first high priest, and he was serving just for 7 days as Aaron was to assume the responsibility. And he then assumes the responsibility on the eighth day together with his children. He had 4 sons. And let's see what the text says. One of the most jarring narratives in the Torah. It ranks with any Genesis narrative. Vayikhu v'nei Aharon, Nadav v'Avihu, ish machtato. Now Aaron's son, Nadav and Avihu, you can see that Eric is beautifully pointing to the place, each took his fire pan, vayitnu vahen esh, and they put fire in this fire pan, vayasimu alav kitoret, and they laid incense on it, vayikrivu lifnei Adonai ish zara, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, asher lo tziva otam, which he had not enjoined upon them. Now, no one is quite sure why this fire was an alien fire. But famously, Vateitze Eish Milifnei Adonai, a fire came forth from the Lord, Vatochal Otam, and consumed them. Vayamutu Bifnei Adonai, thus they died at the instance of the Lord. Now, friends, the rabbis, the commentators wonder, what did they do that was so horrific, which brought about their death? And I once counted probably almost 20 different thoughts as to what they did wrong to have been killed. And in general, I have a teaching, a belief that when you need so many reasons to explain an event, that means that we're groping for the truth. I don't know if that's a proper terminology. I think it is. It could be used in that framework. You're fishing. You're looking for something, and it's precisely because you don't have the answer that we try to offer so many reasons. It's sort of like the rabbi who is reading his or her sermon and is reading it carefully, and in the margin, he writes in his own handwriting, weak point, speak loud. Okay, turns the page, weaker still, even louder. And then weaker, weaker still, scream from the top of your lungs. That's what this is. Sometimes you offer all kinds of reasons. They offer all kinds of reasons. They wanted to replace Moses. They were drunk. And I've given many drashot, many sermons on each of those reasons. The truth is, we don't know. Sometimes in life, we don't know. What we do know is that Aaron is serving with his 4 sons, and 2 sons are murdered. I mean, what is the reaction of a father? They're waiting for this moment. They're waiting for this dedication. And suddenly they're not around anymore. They're gone. They're dead. And so what's the next text? Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, Hu asher diber Adonai. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when the Lord said. Now he says 2 things. Bikrovai ekadesh. Through those near to me, I will show myself holy. Through those who are near me, I will sanctify myself, God says. Va'al penei chol ha'am ekaved. If we can push it. Okay. Va'al penei chol ha'am ekaved. And gain glory before all the people. And Aaron's response, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. I want to read that. Moshe says to Aaron, this is what the Lord has spoken, that 3rd sentence, the bottom sentence. Bikrovai ekadesh. Through those who are nearest me, I will be honored. God says, Va'al penei chol ha'am, and before all the people, ekaved, I will be given glory. Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. So I want to begin. I want to talk about what is happening in that 3rd sentence and the reaction of Moshe and Moses, and then the reaction of Aaron. But I want to begin with a story. And this is a story about the Klosenberger Rebbe. The Klosenberger Rebbe was, am I facing everyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Klosenberger Rebbe was a Rebbe who, during the war, and this is not an exaggeration, this is exactly what happened. By the war's time, he was married with 11 children, and he was the only one to survive. That is to say, his wife was murdered, and each of his 11 children, not one was spared. They were all murdered. And after the war, he escaped. Ultimately, he wound up in Netanya in Israel. He's the rabbi who actually founded the hospital in Netanya, Lariano, I think it's called. Maybe if I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sorry. And he was a great man. He's buried in Netanya, actually not far from where my parents and Toby's parents are buried, in a cemetery called Shipun Vatikim. But when he left Europe, he first came to America. And he was in America for a while. And then he made his way to Israel, where he lived for decades and decades. That was, of course, his primary place where he lived and really made a very, very big difference. And the story is told that he was presiding in America at a circumcision. He was not a mohel, but it's not uncommon for rabbis to be given the honor to name the son who's being circumcised. Now, when one names the son, there is a paragraph. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu kayemet hayel elazer laviv le'imo v'yikarei shmo b'Yisrael, and that's when the name of the child is offered. And in the flow of that paragraph, there is a quote from the book of Yecheskel. And in the book of Yecheskel, there is this scene, which is also mentioned, by the way, in the Haggadah, where the prophet says, Vo'evor alayach. Some people think that this is really the Passover, when the angel was passing over the Jewish homes. Vo'evor alayach, and I passed over you. Va'erech, and I saw, mitboseset bidamayach. You were wallowing, mitboseset, you were almost bathing in your blood. There was so much blood around you. And when we think about October 7th, what was the horror that was going on? Mitboseset bidamayach. Now, what exactly, again, as I've mentioned, what that's alluding to, was it that the angel was flying over and saw the blood on the doorpost of the Paschal lamb, of the circumcision blood? Some say, believe it or not, even of the laws of Ilchot Nidah. It's not clear. But I passed over you and I saw you wallowing in your blood. Va'omar, and I said, the angel says, the prophet calls out, Bidamayich chayi, bidamayich chayi. That's a very famous expression. By your bloods you will live, by your bloods you will live. Now, it's very, very stark. Bidamayich chayi. God willing, I hope to make my way back to Israel for Memorial Day and for Israel's independence. I just can't imagine being in America, not being in Israel, let me say it that way, on these days, especially this year, with now we're almost, I think we're reaching 600 soldiers, just soldiers who have given their lives for the state. It's really quite something. And the reality is, as you've heard me say often, there is no city in Israel that doesn't have on its outskirts a cemetery, a military cemetery, or a section in the cemetery where soldiers are buried. Our children live in Gush Etzion. There's a cemetery as you come into Gush Etzion where all of those who fell, there are soldiers who fell this past war. David Schwartz is buried, and I know exactly where it is. It's right at the entrance to the cemetery so that all can see the victims of terror. The D family is Leo's two daughters and his wife, right there. Um, and it's painful. Yaakov Dan, a teacher of my children, the young man, I'm blocking his name. It's a geriatric moment. Maybe if somebody knows, you can call it out, of the young man who was in his gap year from Boston, and he lost, his last name was Schwartz. He lost his life tragically. And so when the Klosenberger Rebbe came to this point where he had just lost during the war his wife and 11 children, and now he's reading, by your bloods you will live, by your bloods you will live, he stopped. He just couldn't say those two words, whatever it means. I was trying to offer an explanation that sometimes it's only through the bloods of the soldiers who die for the country, and in America too. There's a Memorial Day, except in Israel, I think it's a much more serious day. The whole country comes to a standstill. So by the bloods of those who are ready to give their lives, that's how the country lives. Okay, maybe b'damaya chayi, but he had lost 11 children and a wife. He just couldn't say it. And he just stood there silently, not a word. And then he suddenly blurted it out, b'damaya chayi. And he was asked afterwards, what was going through your mind as you were reciting this? Why did you pause? And then suddenly you were able to say the words. And he said the following: Bidamayach is generally understood to come from the word dam, Dam is blood. He said, when I was reading it, by your bloods you will live, by your bloods you will live, I couldn't say it. I couldn't bring myself, even before God, to say that it's all worth the loss of my 11 children and my wife. By your bloods you will live. But then he said, I recognize that the word bidamayach could also come from the word dome. Dome, domain, means silence. Silence. Bidamayach hayi, he understood, not by your bloods you will live, but sometimes by your silence. There's nothing to say. It's beyond explanation, beyond what anyone can tell me. Bidamaya chayi lashon domain, lashon dumiya. It's that moment, there's a silence. I heard this from Dr. Michael Fishbane, a great, great biblical scholar who was my son's mentor. My son wrote his doctorate for Dr. Fishbane. He says there's a silence that's empty, and then there's a silence, I think his language is, that's pregnant with meaning. And he gives the example of you're at a symphony, you're at a symphony presentation, and the conductor lifts his hands and is ready to begin. And there's like a few seconds at that moment. Now, those seconds are not, it's not an empty silence. It's absolutely silent, but it's a silence of anticipation. It's a fullness. There's a wholeness, almost a holiness in that silence. And so that's what the Klosenbergers said. And I'm wondering, going back to our text, just as an opening, Vayidom Aharon. He just couldn't explain it. Vayidom Aharon. Moshe says what he says, and Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. He was silent. He was speechless. That was the only way he was able to contend with it. And so now, I'd like to share with you a radical interpretation, which actually is the second of the 5 themes in Torat Ahava. And again, anyone who's not received it, it's my gift to you. And Eric, I have to send you, if you've not yet received it, I did ask that a set be sent to you. So let me offer a radical interpretation of what is happening here. Let's go back to the text. And I'd like to offer this as the text, as what happens at that very, very moment. So let's look back at chapter 10. In the first 2 sentences, there's a discussion. There's a presentation of what happened. Aaron's son, Nadab and Abihu, took this fire pan and they put fire on it, and they had incense, and they offered this alien fire that God had not commanded, and the fire came forth at that instant, and they died. Now, this is what immediately happens. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron. Moses says to Aaron, listen, all of this has meaning. I understand why this occurred. And he offers his interpretation. And then Aaron, the Torah tells us, his interpretation was, Bikrovai ekadesh, through those who are close to me, I will be sanctified. Va'al pnei chol ha'am ekaved, and I will be glorified in front of the people. That's what Moshe said. And Aaron's response was a nonverbal response. Moshe responds, Moshe reacts to what occurred. He's trying to offer comfort by offering these explanations. Aaron doesn't respond in words to Moshe. All it says is that Aaron is silent. So here's the suggestion. Perhaps the exchange between the words of Moshe and the reaction of Aaron of silence reveals important lessons about comforting those who are suffering, those who are in pain, those who are mourning. Let's think about this. Aaron was in the midst of the tragedy of tragedies. Two of his children were taken from him. And what's Moshe's way of comforting? Well, often the comforter, and let me judge it very positively, with very good intentions, seeking to do good. We offer sweet words to ease the pain. And so Moshe is offering two classical arguments that I've often heard in houses of Shiva. The first argument is, Bikrovai Ekadesh. Through those near to me, I show myself holy. Now, what is that? Well, I've often heard this argument. And, we are a family. We had a loss of an infant child. The argument is that God only tests those who are worthy or those who are able to handle the test. In other words, the greater the pain and the suffering that you're experienced, that's an indication of the greatness of how high the person who is suffering is. The more suffering you receive, the greater you are. Or to put it simply, God only metes out pain on a level one can handle. God only gives one pain on the level one can handle. It follows that the greater the suffering, the greater the person who is suffering. After all, only those on the highest level, those who are able to navigate the most piercing pain, are singled out by God. And that's what Moses is trying to tell Aaron. Look at sentence 3. Moses says to Aaron, as his two sons are lying dead before him, this is what the Lord spoke. Bikrovai Ekadesh, by those who are closest to me, I will be sanctified. If this has occurred, Aaron, and you're suffering so, it doesn't speak to a mistake you've made, but it speaks to how high you've reached in holiness, as God only metes out pain on the level one can handle. I've heard that argument offered. And yet there's another classical argument that is offered. I have heard it as well. And that argument is that somehow through suffering, greater glory is brought to the larger community as God's name has been publicly sanctified. Could that be Moses' second argument? Let's take a look at this. Let's look at what Moshe says, Eric. Moses says to Aaron, this is what the Lord has spoken in the Hebrew. Number one, he says, Bikrovaya Kadesh. Those are two words, and maybe Moshe amplified it. Aaron, this speaks to your holiness. If you're suffering so, God thinks you're on the high level. If you weren't on such a high level, this could never have occurred to you. And then a second argument, Va'al pnei chol ha'am ekaved. And through all of this, somehow, God's name is publicly sanctified. Now, uttered by Moses, maybe these arguments may have some merit. It takes a lot to go one-on-one against Moses. But I'm just wondering, now open your hearts. The response of Aaron is Vayidom Aharon. Aaron's reaction, Vayidom Aharon, indicates that in his inconsolable state, he was unable to accept Moses' words. Why? Perhaps because the arguments on their merits fell short. That's what I think it was. He says, Vusaretzdir, Moshe, what are you talking about? This is the way God functions. He metes out punishment to those who are able to accept it, and through this, he's glorified. Or maybe, perhaps, even if the arguments had merit, and I don't think they did, but even if they did, they were ill-timed. They were offered too soon. The two bodies were right in front of it. And for me, this is a very powerful message. For me, the message of this exchange is that when offering comfort, it's often best not to speak. It's sometimes best to listen. By the way, there is Jewish law that when one makes a Shiva visit, that the visitor should wait until the mourner speaks first. It's a fascinating law. When making a Shiva visit, that the person visiting should be silent until those who are sitting Shiva can speak. Comforting another means just being there. And so I want to, again, this is a radical interpretation. Vayidom Aharon was Aaron's way of criticizing Moses. It was his way of offering a critique of Moses. Maybe he does so gently. It's a way of showing Moses and showing all of us that at times of the greatest pain, it is often best to be present but silent. Vayidom Aharon. We're understanding Vayidom Aharon after Moses said what he said, which I think was in many ways clueless. But we're understanding Vayidom Aharon, not only that Aaron was silent, but that Aaron was telling Moses, Moses, my dear Moses, now is the time for you to be silent. Now is the time not to speak. I once gave classes on how one should make a Shiva visit. First of all, the timing of a Shiva visit is important. I try to go in the morning at about 10 o'clock because generally there are less number of people who are present. And people ask me, and I try to offer with all of my limitations, what is it that one says at a Shiva visit? And I think the first thing one says is one doesn't say. One listens. One should see, in general, when we speak to each other, we should see the word wait in front of us, W-A-I-T. And W-A-I-T stands for why am I talking? To listen. That's not to say that there aren't ways to encourage a mourner, depending when it is. There's a difference between visiting on the first day, the first 3 days, and the fourth and the fifth day. It's just different when you're closer to what had occurred, and every situation is different. So one may even be more careful when visiting. But what would be some of the questions? Well, often at a Shiva home, people talk about everything except. Well, this is a time actually to comfort the mourner by, when possible, encouraging the mourner to talk about the deceased, memories of the deceased, to share those memories if they're up to. Not everybody wishes to do so. That's why it's important to listen. And when one listens, there's a difference when I hear you. Am I anticipating? Am I anticipating what I'm about ready to say, just waiting for you to be through, regardless of what you say? Or I'm not anticipating. I'm waiting. I'm listening. I really want to connect to what you're saying. And if I'm going to say the same things to two different people in two different situations, I don't get it. This is the time to talk about the person who has passed. And look, what are some of the questions? Are you able to share a story about an anecdote about the relative who has passed? Um, what was the legacy? What was the essence of that person? Or lately, I went to see with Toby Jill Lieberman's family, and I have connections with many of them. And I was sitting with his son Matt out of Atlanta, and I said, Matt, I heard you on the Zoom giving your eulogy, and you really, I could hear your father in you. How are you most like your father? And that's the kind of questions, and you can think of better questions than I can. So what I'm arguing is that in this text, and let me summarize, in the first two sentences, on the dedication day, this hara occurs and they die. Moshe's immediate reaction is he's offering words of comfort. The Krovaya Kadesh, whatever that means, Valpanei Chola Ame Kaved. And Aaron says, shh. Not only am I silent, but Moses, too fast. Vayidom. Sometimes the best way is to just be there. Just be there. Toby always says that when I was 42 years old, I went through very serious open heart surgery. In fact, my doctor always says to me, Dr. Mark Greenberg, when I complain of angina, he says, from 0 to 10, how, you've heard the question, how serious is the pain? So I once said to him, Mark, tell me, when I was going in for that surgery from 0 to 10, how serious was it? And he said to me, it was way beyond 10. It was a serious moment. Just grateful to God. It's a long time ago. And Toby always tells the story that David Mann, who was then the president of the shul, dear friend of blessed memory, so he came to sit with Toby in the waiting room. And Toby always says, he sat there for 5 hours. He didn't say a word. Didn't say a word. Just being there. Just showing up. Just being there, that could say it all. So I want to stop here and get your reaction to this different take of this text.
Yeah.
Yes, Tova.
Say something. Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say, B'jamayich Chayim. I mean, just the act of childbirth is very bloody. So, just being born,
as usual, Tov, you're like, that's beautiful. It's not beautiful, but it's so insightful, right?
But, and I'm gonna say something about Aharon's sons, and you probably won't agree. Nobody will agree, but these thoughts came last year when you spoke about this, and you noted that Moshe really didn't say anything comforting to Aharon, and Aharon didn't object. He didn't say anything. And so what I think is, this was the first generation out of Egypt. And human sacrifice was the way to honor a God. And Aaron's sons knew this, but they knew all the new rules also. And I'm sure they spoke about this to their father, to their uncle. And when the time came, they decided, yeah, we did all this, but we also have to sacrifice ourselves, human sacrifice, in order to do the proper thing for this new God that we're worshiping. And to Moshe and Aharon, it was not a shock. They knew that this was something that the boys had talked about, because otherwise, why didn't Moshe say something comforting? why shouldn't Aaron just scream out? Not even say anything, but scream out. I mean, two sons are burnt up in front of him. And I think it was because this is what the sons had planned.
So you're saying, Tova, that you think they took their own lives?
Yes.
It's almost like the imagery of the Akedah, of the binding, yes, where Abraham takes Isaac. He doesn't sacrifice. Aaron is with his two sons, and they do give their lives.
But Abraham is ready to do it. Human sacrifice was a thing. That was the way you honored God.
And Aaron, was he in agreement with what they did, or?
That wasn't that they were in agreement, but it was not a shock.
I see.
Because otherwise, why didn't his brother comfort him? Why didn't he accept words of comfort? Neither one of them acted the way we expect.
Thank you, Tova.
And that was
you opened up,
as you said last year.
A whole new pathway of understanding this. And I didn't know I gave this last year. I do remember once, I work very hard on my talks I prepare. I always tell Eric and all the chevra that if you ask me what's the most important thing about a talk or a class or a sermon, I think the most important thing is to prepare. There's nothing more precious in life than time. So if you get up there for 15, 20 minutes and you're not prepared, it means you're insulting your audience. 20 minutes times how many people are there. And, you know, a second lived is a second you never have back. So I'm always preparing. So Tova, I prepare this talk very, very carefully, make sure it's new, it's different. I was quite happy with it. I give this creative new talk. And then I step down, and then Hillel Jaffe, who's got a memory, like, he looks at me and says, Rabbi, you gave the same talk 15 years ago. I didn't remember I gave it. I had to recreate it. He remembered it.
No, I thought your talk about a Shiva visit was wonderful. But
thank you.
I think that the death of Aaron's sons, I think that is more problematic. But
yes,
but it was because you said last year. That's what got me thinking.
Yeah,
what do you mean? They didn't comfort him.
Yeah,
and Aaron didn't accept any comfort.
Yeah,
or scream out.
Joan, what do you think, Joan? Thank you, Tova.
I appreciate everybody's point of view, and Rabbi, I appreciate how you are in a Shiva house. But I think this was a time of harsher realities. And in my mind, the key word is alien, which I don't know Hebrew well enough to know what it means. And I think that's what Moshe was explaining to him. They did the wrong thing, and therefore they are punished that way. And I believe that Aaron accepted that, therefore he was silent.
Yes, Joan, that is the way it's normatively, and that is the literal interpretation of this. We offered something a little bit, as we said as kids, a little off the wall, but your interpretation is the flow of the interpretation. It's fascinating that the Hebrew word for alien is zara, zar. Zar is alien, but the word zar is also zer, which means a crown, which is a positive thing. So I guess in life, that which could be taken in a negative direction, if tweaked, could be most positive, and the reverse is equally true. But Joan, your interpretation is the normal way of understanding it, that it was an alien fire. And that's why there are all of these commentaries of what was that alien fire? What could they have done to have been deserving of being killed on the spot? And that's the debate, what it is. And that's why I argue that sometimes when it's so many possibilities, one wonders, are we baying at the moon? Is it But thank you, Joe. Anyone else?
Arnie. Arnie.
Yeah, Avi, I have two questions for you.
Yes.
One, that it took place on the 8th day. I don't know exactly what it means, but I know the mystics have a lot to say about the number 8. So I was wondering about that. And also, I was wondering about what the names of Nadav and Avihu mean.
Mm-hmm. Well, Avihu is a compound of Av and Hu. It's a great question. So Av and Hu means Av is father, Hu means he, and it's sort of Zekeli ve'anvehu. It does reflect a relationship with God, Vavihu, that there's a relationship between the Father, between God, and between the Hu, between Avihu. Nadav, it means gift. Our grandson is Nadav, our little one. He now speaks Hebrew. They made Aliyah. So this little pitcher cut, 3 years old, is speaking Hebrew. Like, amazing how he's picked it up. It means nidava. Nidava is like, it's a charitable gift. And the number 8 is a very serious number. You know, in the world of mysticism, Arnie, 6, in 6 stages, God created the world. In 7, that's Shabbat, that's spirituality. And 8 is even above the spirituality. Ari Hart always gave these magnificent talks. Ari's a musician. Do you remember he gave the talk about there are 7 notes? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. But there's an 8th note, to. But the 8th note is the same as the first note, except it's an octave higher. That's the step above the spirituality. And in our class is one of my teachers, Daniel Langer, whom I spoke with earlier. Daniel is a student of Kasuto, and Kasuto is the Rebbe of 7s and 3s, but 7s. And Daniel could cite chapter and verse of sentence after sentence that is in multiples of 7. And when the word appears 7 times, it means that that is the central theme of that paragraph. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. First sentence of the Torah has 7 words. Ve'haaretz hayta tov vavo v'choshech al pnei tahom ruach Elokim rachet al pnei hamayim. Second sentence, 14 words. That's 7 multiple times 2. And Danny could probably, as we're sitting here, I would imagine, Danny, you can give hundreds, maybe even in the thousands of examples. And I just wish, Dan, that Kasuto could see your work. He would ship a lot of nachas. So, Dan, keep doing it.
Through Reb Abi Marisham, who taught me Kasuto.
Please, go ahead.
One of the themes of Kasuto on the
he lived in the 1950s, by the way. He was Italian in origin. I think he moved to Israel. He taught at Hebrew University. But so we're now in the 50s. Go ahead, Danny.
He taught that the sacrificial and the temple service had a lot of parallels with polytheistic ceremonies and even the structures within the Mishkan. But the difference is what made it what's the most important thing. And so the bringing of a fire offering had to be Kodesh, the way God made it different from the alien practices. And when you do something that's different, that's more like the alien practices, that cannot be, because it's the difference that makes all. And okay, I'll say one more thing, because I've been working on Devarim and counting words, and the term Hamakom Asher Yivchar, the place that I shall choose, which is the Temple Mount of Jerusalem, appears a multiple of 7 times. I think it's 21 and 14 times. But one of them that completes the set is a runaway slave shall choose whatever place he chooses. Hamakom Asher Yivchar, he shall let him live there. And that is one of what completes the set of choosing the place that God shall choose. There's a place for the runaway slave also. There's a human element that makes the set complete.
Right, and just to conceptualize that, Danny, Makom Asher Yivchar is generally understood as being Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the Bible, it never says Yerushalayim. The prophet is full of Yerushalayim. In the Quran, of course, Jerusalem is not mentioned at all. But I would say B'makom Asher Yivchar is Jerusalem. But for the slave, wherever he escapes, that's his or her Jerusalem. That's, I think, the conceptual relationship between the two. Jerusalem is our spiritual safety haven. But for a slave, wherever I think it shows how, look, there was slavery, and of course, slavery is the lowest of the low. And I don't have to tell you that there's been a lot of studies done about how there were even Orthodox rabbis in the 1860s who were from the South, and some who were from the North, who found credence and supported slavery based on the Bible. And I just offer a prayer that if I were living then, that I would not have fallen into that trap. When all of society is saying that slavery is right, you really, with all of our integrity, with the help of God, we have to pray that we're on the right side of what is right, what is clearly we know to be right now. But then it wasn't, tragically, it wasn't that clear. So I love what you're saying about Yivchar, and Danny, just continue doing your research. It's also, by the way, a big statement about Jerusalem, that Jerusalem is as holy as we make it. God chose it. It'll always be the chosen place. Whether it's the holy place, that's up to us. We've got to do everything we can we may be the chosen people. We'll always be the chosen people. That doesn't mean we're the holy people. We have to be worthy of that chosenness, which I think there's some truth to that. I'll take one more comment, and I think we'll call it a day. Anybody? I see Clara is there. Wow. Clara, how are you doing? Straight from Jerusalem. Wow. It just brings tears to my eyes to see you, Clara. Just thinking of Phil, and thank God we were together then. And Edith, I think Edith is on. Wow, we got a whole great. Ruby, do you have any thoughts on this, my Ruby? Right. Okay, Eric, you have the last word as usual. You knew what was going to happen. What does Toby always say to everyone who gets smicha from Chovevei Amarat? She always says, never leave the house without a Dvar Torah.
Well, one thing I want to just say, something just building off of what Tova said, this idea of human sacrifice, and, the idea that I think Dan was talking about, of that it was all of these historical things that come together. And I wonder if one of the ways to read that Eish Zara is whether it was an agreed upon thing, but I wonder if this Eish Zara was this ideological thought to bring in outside Kodesh, not Kodesh fire, right? To bring in something that was, you know, pagan or something that was avodah zarah like.
Right.
And whether that was on purpose or not, that just with the swaying of the wind, something that you might think is what God wants isn't something that is intended in the way that you are trying to make it happen. I think that it's a statement on intent almost as much as it is on the action itself, that your intent could be good, but, you know, as we say, words can hurt people even if that's not your intent, right? So
Right.
I wonder if this is a reminder to us to think through the way that other people or other, you know, how God can interpret our actions and our intent behind them, and that just because we think that the intent is good doesn't necessarily mean that God would agree.
I think on that brilliant, beautiful note, I see a lot of nods that it's really resonating. So, Eric, I can't thank you enough.
Can I
I
say
always say
something,
you're my
Rabbi?
Rebbe. Hi, Clara. Yes, Clara.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course. First,
Okay.
tell us how you're doing.
Very difficult. Grief counseling, lavender oil for antidepressant, and a lot of support. And yesterday, the first time I had lunch with Kenny and Sandy. And Kenny said, Philip said to me, what's the matter with you? You still didn't see Clara? And they came. But what I wanted to say is I'm not a scholar, but in our family, it used to be a joke that if my daughter kills somebody, my mother would say his life was not worthy and a million of other reasons. Because my mother would always find an explanation because she loved Maya so much. When he lost his two sons, at that point, at that minute, he could not think they done something wrong. All he could think is what I lost. Maybe next day, maybe in a year, maybe later, he could realize whatever they did. But that minute, it was all grief and loss and pain, and he couldn't even speak. That is what I think.
And Clara, do you think Moshe made a mistake by speaking, by offering, given what you just said?
I don't think he made a mistake. I think that I realize that now that I'm in mourning, women relate to me much easier, and men, even the one who really good and wonderful people and have good thoughts, they don't know what to say. So when you're in a situation like this, you don't know before what to say, you say what comes. And that's what he said. And whether it was right or wrong, he was trying to say something to his brother which he thought would help. And yes, maybe it didn't help.
Maybe it did. Maybe it did.
And maybe it didn't, right? So,
right. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank all of you. And you can see that I think I'm learning that I should always talk less, because what's most powerful is your reactions. There's so much that I can learn from, and I thank all of you. Really, thank you so much. Next week we go to the Haggadah, and then I'm going to be giving a session on the Haggadah, especially during Israel's war. So just want to talk a little bit about that and touching upon the Haggadah that Tova and that we're doing together.
Glad you're feeling better, Rabbi.
Okay, rest up, Peter. Thank you.
Hey. Bye.
God bless. Love you all.
Bye, Clara.